Hi, everyone. Hopefully you're all here for building apps with ArcGIS Maps SDK for JavaScript components. My name is Kelly Hutchins. I'm a developer on the Instant App team. And I'm here with my colleague Omar, who works on the components team. So let me switch it over to him. He's going to get us started.
All right, let's talk about web components. First, what are web components? They're not your regular HTML elements. Web components are custom elements that allow us to encapsulate complex functionality and styling using different technologies such as custom elements and the shadow DOM. And to help illustrate that, we can look at the code that's screenshotted. First, you have the core JavaScript API code, which you're kind of used to writing. Web map, you have your web map, you have your map view, and it's assigned to the view div in the body at the top. But then what we do is we take web component technology and we extend the HTML div element to put it into what we call the ArcGIS map. In the end, what you get is this nice one-liner ArcGIS map. And so with web components, you can have one tag for one feature, and you don't really need to know what's going on in the middle, and it's just simple. Now, why else would you use web components? Well, they're native to the browser, and they're compatible with front-end tools and frameworks. This is a screenshot from MDN, and it just says, across different browsers like Safari, Firefox, Chrome, Edge, they're compatible. The browser understands custom elements. As well, they enhance the experience of beginner and advanced developers. When you work in a framework like React or Vue, we're really speaking your language. You can, because for example, you have JSX in React, which is JavaScript plus HTML. Now you're writing HTML first, so you don't have to do this whole use effect workflow that can be a bit awkward. And then they allow us to offer more pre-built ArcGIS experiences. So in some cases, when you want to write functionality with the JavaScript Maps SDK, you have to write a lot of code, and then you have to wrap it into a React component or an Angular component, or if you're in a vanilla JavaScript application, you'd load it in from another file, all that functionality. So you're writing a lot of code, but we're also writing maybe similar workflows as well, and then you might see that stuff in MapViewer, like our analysis tools, or you see the arcade editor in MapViewer dashboards, and you want access to that, so we're just giving it to you. Anything that we write as well, we want to give you access as well. And it provides a consistent user experience. So when you're working in one application from ArcGIS and then working in another, you're not thrown off by the UI. It's like, oh, I've seen this before, and I know how to work with it just because of my experience with it. And it's great for code reuse for us and improving productivity, so we don't have to write one thing in React and then rewrite it in Vue. We just write it once as a web component and reuse it in multiple places. Now I'll pass it to Kelly.
Great, thanks. So we're gonna take a super quick dive into the documentation for how you get started. So the first place to come is the JavaScript SDK, which you're probably all familiar with. But you'll see that there's this components beta section right here. There's some great documentation that Omar was instrumental in getting up and running. But we'll dive into some of this more later and go through some of these individual topics. But I also wanted to point out this component API topic. If you come here, it takes you to the Storybook, which we'll also spend a little bit more time with later. But some of the key elements here are the component reference you'll find here. You'll also find information on getting started and tutorials. So there's a few tutorials with step-by-step instructions for getting up and running. And then there's also these links to individual templates depending on what you're working in. So if you want to do AMD script tags, Vite or Webpack build tools, Angular, Vue, or React frameworks. So you have some choices. You could click on one of these links and it takes you to the GitHub repository with that sample. So you could either clone the repo or individually download that directory. So just to reiterate, there's a lot of great doc. If you get started with the JS API SDK site, then you can explore the help topics there, and then come visit the Storybook for more information on working with the individual map components, chart components, and coding components. Let me switch it back.
All right, now I'm sure a lot of you work in different environments, and we'll cover those and how you can use components with your particular programming pattern. To do that, we can go to the documentation site, and underneath components beta, there's a programming patterns topic, and we'll go over attributes versus properties. On HTML elements, you can set attributes, and attributes are only of type string, boolean, simple types. But then properties are usually objects, arrays, more complex types that you have to set in JavaScript. So if you're working in a vanilla JavaScript application, you'd set a script tag or maybe create a separate JavaScript file and then start working from there on your components. But with attributes, you just set them directly on. It's pretty convenient. And then if you wanted to figure out what is an attribute and what is a property on a component, you can just go to the component reference that Kelly showed earlier, pick any one of the components. I'll focus on the map component. And so under properties, you have one column that says property, one that says attribute. So if the attribute column is empty, you know that you can't set the property in HTML. But in frameworks, you actually can set the properties on the component, but we'll get into that later. And there's a description and what type it is. So you can already see a bit of a complex type, like collection, layer view, and then the background is a color background type. So that's why you can't set it in HTML. But then the base map can be a string, so you can set it directly on it. And then you have the base map view and so on. So if you follow this workflow, if you work in vanilla JavaScript, so you know, okay, I see a property and there's no attribute, I'm going to go work on it in vanilla JavaScript. But if I'm in a component or if I'm in a framework and I see property, I can just work directly on the component with that property. And then if there's no attribute, obviously you can't use it in HTML. And then you have methods and events, and we'll get into those later. And what's nice about this Storybook as well, if we go to a different component like the area measurement 2D, and I go to show code, I can actually copy the code snippet. And there's controls for the attributes, for some of the attributes. So if I wanted to change the position to bottom left, you'll see that'll update. And there's another attribute called units. So if I wanted to change to metric, that unit will appear in that code snippet, and I can just copy that into whatever I'm working in. So that's attributes and properties. We also have instances where you'd want to watch for changes. You can use component events for that. In most cases, sometimes you want to watch for additional things, and we'll get into that later. But again, you can go to the component reference, click events, and you see there's an area measurement 2D ready. So when the component's ready, you can start doing any additional work if you have any. And then in the map component, there's the ArcGIS view ready change event. So when the map view is ready, you can then get access to the web map, get access to the view for any work that you'd like. There's also other events like view change. So when the scale changes or when the zoom changes on the map. So you can use events that already exist on the component, but what if you wanted to watch for other things like the attributes? So for that, you could use a mutation observer, but there's a little caveat. You can only watch for things that are reflected on the DOM. And to find what you can watch on the DOM, you can, again, go back to the component reference and just have a scroll. For example, base map, not reflected on the DOM. But if we go down to updating, down here, you can see that this attribute is reflected on the DOM. And I'll just show very briefly what that looks like in DevTools. So if I start panning around the map, I can see updating. It pops up for a few brief seconds and then goes away. And how did I set up that mutation observer to watch the updating attribute change? Well, you just create a mutation observer and then assign it to that map component. And then anytime in this for loop, I pick up, oh, there's a mutation of type attribute, and its attribute's name is updating. Do a console log. You can use it for other work. If maybe you had a map where you wanted to have a scrim that was showing while the map was updating, you could do that. So that's one way to also watch for changes. Then there's also proxies. So with proxies, you can watch properties change. So this is different than attributes and the fact that attributes have to be reflected on the DOM. In proxies, you can watch properties. And so if I go back to my sample, I'm just going to comment this out and go to my proxy. I can change the web map that was shown in the map earlier just by using a proxy. And usually your framework will do this for you. You know, your typical use state in React. they'll create a proxy to a specific, your component, and then from there, it'll figure things out for you. So if I just we'll create my web map, replace this one, go back, and then let's check out the results of the map. Okay, so the web map should have changed, and it should tell you proxy the map. The map property has changed. So with the proxy object that was created, I can see that the web map was changed. Even though I use the same item ID in that case for the web map, it still recognized that, oh, there's a property on that map component that actually changed. So again, this is all in vanilla JavaScript, and we'll show later how this is easier when you're using frameworks. And continuing forward, we have associating components with a map or scene. So in the examples I've shown so far with the map, I nested components inside of a map component. So the legend component already knows that, oh, I'm inside of a map. I'm going to use that information from there. But when you use the reference element attribute that Kelly will cover later, the legend can reference an element that's outside, that it's not inside of, which is pretty useful when you're using the calcite design system and you want to put a legend in a sidebar or in some sort of other user experience. And you have dealing with local assets, which again, Kelly will cover when we get to frameworks. And localization, so our components, we want to offer different language support. And this is talked about in detail, but for the map components, it's still configured towards how you would have done localization in the core JavaScript API, but the other components like charts components and coding components, they follow what you might have found with using calcite for their localization. And then now, I know we covered a lot of different programming patterns, but a lot of that is simplified as soon as you get to frameworks. So I'm not only talking about frameworks in the sense of, oh, when you go to a large application that, or when you're trying to use Node that you might want to use a framework, but also it can make a lot of your vanilla JavaScript work simpler. So look at React, for example. You have an item ID you can set directly on the component. We did that in vanilla JavaScript, fine. But then let's take a look at the center property. It could be used as an attribute. You could pass it in as a string, but what if you wanted to pass in an array? You can't do that in HTML, but you could do that in React directly on the components. You could do center equals this array. And then before we added event listeners, you can do document.querySelector, add event listener, ArcGIS view ready change. So you're writing all that in vanilla JavaScript in a separate file or in a different script tag. But then in React, you just do on ArcGIS view ready change some event, and then again, directly on the component. So we didn't have to go into a separate file for this or in a different section on our HTML file. We just did it directly on the component, which can be pretty convenient. And the same logic applies when you're working in Angular. You'd follow their syntax. So every framework has their own grammar for working on properties and adding event listeners. So in Angular, you'd use the parentheses, and then on properties, you'd use square brackets. And then looking at view, you'd use view's directives. So you have v-bind, and then colon, and then center, and then you'd have v-on. There's other shortcuts. We could have used an @ for v-on, but just for clarification, when you look up that directive, there's a shorthand form. So that covers all the property or all the programming patterns for web components, and we'll just look at some code briefly. So again, you have the core JavaScript API, which I'm sure most of you have seen. You have your view div container element, and then you have initializing your web map and your map view, and you add all these elements to the view. And then if you wanted to use events, you'd use view.when to see when the view's ready. But then go back to the components code, and you just put the legend and the search inside of the map. And then if you wanted to add an event listener in vanilla JavaScript, you just do your query selector, you'd add your event listener, see that the view's ready, and then you can, from there, work on the map or the view. And then you have, in a view application, again, with the core JavaScript API, it's kind of awkward. You're following the same thing that you kind of did in the vanilla JavaScript application, but you're trying to shoehorn that into a Vue application. You're not really following that familiar syntax that you'd expect. So here you'd have to do an async mounted, and then when that Vue div is mounted, you can then start setting up your application. But then you look at the component code, and it's actually quite nice. You have, again, the vbind, so you're adding a theme to that map. And if you look at the JavaScript we wrote, all we did was import theme, but then you look at, on the other side, you're importing all these different things, because you have to import the widget, you have to import the web map and map view. But here we're only importing the theme, and then we're setting the theme, and we can easily just pass it to the component. And you could write your functions inline. You could write like the onReady event. We could have written it inline, but for clarity, it's in the script section under function onReady. And really, that's all there is to it. You can now follow Vue's grammar instead of mixing and matching. And it's speaking the language of the developer who works in that framework. And with that, I'll pass it back to Kelly.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about working with frameworks and build tools, but I first kind of want to get a sense of where people are. How many people out here are using AMD and vanilla JavaScript right now? A couple people. Okay, how about a build tool like Vite or Webpack? Yeah. How about framework, React? Angular? Vue? Okay, cool. So we got a bunch of everybody mixed in. Okay, so first, I just wanted to talk a little bit about getting started. We'll go to the documentation and do this. So there's this nice overview help topic that'll be a good place for you to get started. The first sort of topic in here is AMD versus ArcGIS, via the ArcGIS CDN. So this is what people who are using Require are currently doing. You can do this with the components, but I would highly encourage you at this point to start exploring the second option, so ESM via NPM. And I'll show you how quick and easy it is, if you haven't worked with that before, to get up and running with a simple application. I think it's the first step towards a more modern tooling, a more modern web development experience. You don't have to go full on straight to the frameworks. Using Vite with vanilla JavaScript and ESM can be a good stepping stone. You can write code. If your application's simple, you can get it done really easily, and you start getting used to the concepts that you might need later on if you find your app becoming unwieldy and you end up wanting to take advantage of the framework. Or if you get tired of using the programming patterns that Omar mentioned earlier, and you want to take advantage of some of the framework, the things the frameworks do to make it easier for you. So there's more information here if you do want to use AMD versus via the CDN. You can read some information here. There's also a separate little broken out topic that has some tips, tricks, and kind of gotchas there. But then the other choice is ESM via NPM, and in addition to that, the frameworks. So I just want to keep pointing out the documentation because we only have a 1 hour session and there's a lot of good information in there to read through. So, you know, the components are compatible with most modern frameworks. We have tutorials, the ones I pointed out earlier, that are accessible via the Storybook. You have React, Angular, and Vue frameworks, and the Webpack and Vite build tools. There's also an AMD JavaScript one if that's your jam. You can take a look at that. So Omar mentioned the assets earlier. So you have two choices, CDN versus a local copy. So what are the assets, first of all? There are things like styles, images, localization files. I have a typo on the slide, I just noticed, in localization. But that kind of thing, those are assets. So the CDN is the easiest one for most use cases. You don't have these assets bundled with your local build, and it's really easy to set up and run. You can do local assets. If you do the local assets, you'll probably want to set up something like a build script to copy those assets from node modules into your project. And the sample shows how to do it. There's a little blurb on the slide that uses this NPM package CPX. You can just install that. and then copy, in this case, the ArcGIS core assets to this public assets folder in your application. So you can set that up in your package.json scripts file. And if you want to, yeah, okay, sorry. If you want to use the local assets, after you've copied them, you import set asset path from the components, and you point it to the location, those local assets. So the next thing you'll want to do is register the components. So what this does is it makes the components available for use in the application. The first approach we'll look at is lazy loading. To do that, you use define custom elements. So what define custom elements does is it registers all those components for you. So they're registered, but they're not actually initialized until they're needed in the application. So you're not, increasing the load on your app necessarily. So define custom elements registers them. When they're needed, they're initialized. And lazy loading takes care of that for us. And then you can also point, so the assets we mentioned on the earlier slide, you can point to local or CDN assets. In this example here, we're setting define custom elements, and we're giving it a resource URL where we're pointing to the assets on the CDN. So the other option is loading them each individually. So you manually load each component. So here we have that set asset path that we saw on the earlier slide, where we're pointing that asset path to those local assets. So this would be a case where maybe you set up that copy script in your package.json to copy those assets over. And then you individually load each or import each component that you want to use into your application. So now I'm going to do a quick Vite demo. So this would be something to pay attention to for those of you who are currently working with AMD, JavaScript, and want to start the migration process. So the first thing you do is just go to that GitHub repo. If you already work with GitHub and you're familiar with it, you can clone this repo, get all the samples locally. If it's new to you and you don't work with GitHub, you can literally just come here, download this directory as a zip file, and host it, and host it locally on your computer. So I've downloaded that already and opened it up in Visual Studio Code. So if I look at it, there's this Vite config file. So this is what tells this build tool, Vite, anything extra you want it to do. The nice thing about Vite, if you've worked with Webpack before, the configuration can feel really heavy, and you kind of have to learn a lot about Webpack, it feels like, to get it right. Vite is kind of opinionated and just takes care of a lot of things for you. So for the most part, you don't really need to look at the documentation too much until you're trying to do something more out of the norm kind of thing. So we have this config file. There's the README. There's a package.json file where we have the dependencies that this application uses. So the JS API, the map components, and the calcite components. It has some build scripts set up for you that you can run, and we'll see how the dev script works. And then we have our index.html file. So if you look at this, you can see that we have our components here. We have the map with an item ID to a web map. And inside of that, we have the search component and the legend component that we're adding to the map. And then we have that lazy loading of the components that we talked about. So here's that define custom elements, and then we point it to the CDN. We have a little bit of extra logic that's just in the sample showing you how to know when the map's ready. This should look familiar to people who've been working with JavaScript. So if I want to run this app and start working, in Visual Studio Code, I can just install a new or open a terminal, type npm install. So what this does is it installs those dependencies. That's ArcGIS core, calcite components, and the map components. So it's going through and installing those into the node modules folder. I should have pre-done this. It's taking a second. OK, so now it's done. And then the next thing, all I have to do is do npm run dev. And if you remember in that package.json file I showed you, there was a build script called dev that just runs this Vite. So what that does is it spins up this local server for you. It's pretty fast. Your application is here. you can look at it. We've got the map, we have the search component up here, and we have the legend. So that one little file with a tiny bit of code replaced all the old logic you used to have to do. And the nice thing is with Vite, that live server knows when I'm doing things. So if I were to come in here and decide, oh, I don't really want the legend in my app, save it, go back, my legend's gone. So you don't have to reload the browser or do anything. You literally just make your changes in your IDE, and then that live dev server is really fast, and it shows you those updates. So super simple, good way to get started, start playing around with components. Okay, so the first one we'll talk about is React. There is a help topic. I linked to it at the top of here. You currently need a separate package, a React-friendly package, if you want to work with React. It's pretty common if you're a React developer to have these wrapper packages, at least right now. This takes care of things like events. React expects these events to have a different name. So instead of ArcGIS view ready change, the React events are on ArcGIS view ready change. And it handles the casing. So if you look at the element on the screen, you can see that it's capital A, ArcGIS, uppercase M, map, all one word with no hyphen in between, where the components, if we looked at the Vite sample, were ArcGIS-map. So with React, you can load the components, either lazy load them or local assets. That's the stuff we talked about on the earlier asset slide. You can do either one. Or you can load them individually. So the thing that you have to look at with both of these, the first code snippet up at the top, we import the ArcGIS map, ArcGIS search, and ArcGIS legend from the React component package. And then we import define custom elements, and then we point it to the assets on the CDN. So that's what we're doing in the lazy loading approach. The load individual approach is on the bottom image. So there we import the set asset path. And then we individually import each of the components that we want to work with. And then we also have the import statement where we import them from React, and then we set the asset path. So just a slightly different approach, but both work in React. So there's also a help topic on Angular. There's an Angular-friendly package. It's available at ArcGIS Map Components Angular. When you work with this, you're working with the components as if they were native Angular components. There's also a template, a starter template available for you if you're an Angular developer. You can check that out. With Angular, you have to lazy load the components. You use define custom elements in this ng on init in the first module you have that's using the components. So it's called that one time, and we'll handle that registering the components. And then you import this component library module, and then once you've done that, you can work with those components again as if they were native Angular components. So the sample here looks pretty similar to what we've been looking at before. We have, we're back to the names that we expect, the ArcGIS-map, and then we have this event, ArcGIS view ready change. And then view is nice. It doesn't need this other wrapper. It just works. There's this website called Custom Elements Everywhere. And if you look on here, Vue has this score of working with web components of 100%. So for the most part, stuff just works in Vue, and it's pretty easy. I will say that for this demo, I know React, but I didn't know Vue, and I wanted to learn Vue. I watched like a 1-hour video, and then I built a demo app, and I found it pretty intuitive and really easy to get up and running. So that's another choice if I found it much easier than getting started with React, I'll say that. So it's something to take a look at. So Vue has these nice directives. There's a link to this kind of cheat sheet here. These are just these HTML attributes that tell Vue what to do with these DOM elements. So I just kind of listed some of the common ones you'll see here, or in our sample app that we're going to look at in a minute. The first one is v-bind, and that binds an expression it binds an attribute to an expression. So we'll see an example of that. You can shortcut it. Instead of doing v-bind in front of an attribute, you can just do colon and then the attribute name, and we'll look at that. You can render list items with v-4. So this is really nice. Like, let's say you want to make a template inside of it with a bunch of items. You can just v-4, and then it's going to loop through whatever array you gave it and build out that list for you. You can also have v-if, v-else. So maybe you can say, if this web map has bookmarks, render this bookmarks component, right? So it'll conditionally draw this stuff. And then v-on can be shortcutted with the @ sign, is how you can handle events. So view, like I said, it kind of just works. You can do it lazy loaded or load individually. This is an example that shows some of those directives. So here we have our item ID, and then we're doing v-bind, or remember I said you could just use the colon, this center property. Oops. It's a little bit of a contrived example because here we have it hard-coded, but maybe you're getting the center from a URL parameter or something and you want to use it that way. And then we have v-on, where we have that event. So that's where we're listening to our event. And in this example, we have that event function inlined inside of that component. So now we're going to take a quick look at the source code for the demo. And this is written in Vue, but you could do it in any of those other frameworks that are available to you. So let's take a quick look at what we've got going on in here. So here we have our index.html. It's literally just pointing to this JavaScript file, which is like our starting point of the application. So if we come in here, we just import our CSS file. And then we import this app component that we have created. So let's look at that app component. It's here, this app.view. This has kind of three pieces. It has this script tag up here, which has some JavaScript. It has this template here, which is a lot of our components. And then it has some CSS down here at the bottom. So this, let's look at the application really quickly. This is kind of an application that sort of has a lot going on. We have a calcite shell. So we have this header up here that's part of calcite. We have this splash screen that's hooked off an info button down here. We have these, an action bar from calcite with these actions in it. When you click on the actions, it opens the individual legend or bookmarks. So there's quite a few things going on in the application, but there's not really that much code that you have to write to get that application because of components. So here at the top, you can see that we have our defined custom elements that we talked about on an earlier slide. We have two of them here. We have calcite, defined custom elements. We gave it an alternate name of defined calcite element so we can tell it apart from defined custom elements from the map components. So we register both the calcite components and the map components. Then again, there's that JavaScript and the template. So we use the calcite shell. That gives us the overall layout. This calcite navigation, that gives us that header. Here is that action that opens up our splash screen. We have this event, this @click, that opens that info modal. So that's part of the JavaScript up here. And that just opens up this info modal that we have defined. Then we have the shell panel, which is the panel where we have the legend and the bookmarks. So Omar mentioned earlier that we'd talk about reference element. So you don't need this reference element property for the bookmarks if it's embedded inside of the map and shows on the map view. So if you have the ArcGIS map tags and you put the search or the bookmarks or the legend or any of the other components in there, it's going to render it on the map at the position you tell it to. But if you want to put it in a panel in calcite or some other location outside of the map, all you have to do is use this reference element attribute and point it to the map. So we have those panels here. And then we have our map. We made a separate component that has that ArcGIS-map in it. And then finally, I work on the Instant App team. We have components too. So I just threw our Instant App components here as an example of, you can use calcite components, you can use mapping components, or coding components, or chart components, or some other web component library that you're interested in. And it's all just kind of works together and is pretty seamless. So I just threw that Instant App component in there. And we'll look at the map. So I mentioned that we have the map in a separate file. So here, again, we have the same setup. We have the template that has our ArcGIS map. Inside of it, so we don't need that reference element because the expand is inside of that map. So here we don't have the reference element. We're just putting that expand on top of the map. Then we have a little bit of script that we don't need. Again, this is just an example showing how you know when the map is ready. But this could be removed from the code. And then we have a little bit of CSS styling it here. So it's not very complicated. I think Vue makes it, Vue plus the components, make it a really easy way for developers to make fairly sophisticated apps and get up and running quickly. This app also makes use of some of those Vue directives. We can just look at a couple of them here. So here's an example of that v-if. So I detect, I inspect the map to see if it has bookmarks inside that web map. And if it does, it will show that bookmarks widget. If it does not, it won't. And that's all I have to do. I don't have to write a bunch of logic, if then, else. I can just say v-if has bookmarks, which is a property we have defined as true, then show this component. If not, don't. And then I also bind it to the active tool. So if this bookmarks tool is active, I'm going to show that bookmarks panel. If not, I'm not going to. We have some more v-binding here on the panel to determine if the bookmarks action is open or closed. So this is a lot of logic that can all be handled with those directives and Vue. And React and Angular also have their own mechanisms that make a lot of this easier than some of the things that Omar showed you with Mutation Observer and Proxy. So let me check the slides. Yep, I'm going to turn it back to Omar, and he's going to show you a few more cool things.
Yeah, so I'm going to take a bit of a different step than Kelly. What she showed was how you can take map components and bring them into a calcite shell panel. But what if you wanted to create your own components and then put them into a map? Components that aren't in map components, for example. And you could do that with an ArcGIS placement component. And it doesn't take much to write. So you use ArcGIS placement component, set the position to wherever you'd like it. So I want to put it bottom right. And then I'm going to use a calcite notice just as an example of something I can put into the map. And if you're creating different experiences for your users, this is great because it's different than the view.ui.add that you might have been used to with the core JavaScript API. And so here's a demo from the core JavaScript API website that says, using the views UI. And what they've done is they've added a logo to the bottom right. And the way they've done that is in the HTML body, they created a logo div. And you have view.ui.add logo div bottom right. But instead, with web components, you can just use the placement component and put it directly in that map at whatever position you'd like. So again, here, another sample. I place the calcite button inside of ArcGIS placement, and it just works. So here, if you weren't working with calcite, or maybe you were working with calcite and you just wanted to combine these two patterns, you could, using that component. And in the end, this is what it looks like. You have the notice on the bottom right, and you can just click it away. And then if I refresh the page, it'll just come up again. It's just to tell users, hey, by the way, if you want to see source code, it's there. And so, it's very flexible. So if you wanted to use calcite side panel, you wanted to have things outside the app, outside the map or in that map, choice is totally up to you, and you don't have to use map components for that. Have specific legend, search, if you wanted to extend whatever you'd like. And with that, we'll talk about, as well, going back to resources. We've covered the docs, we've covered Storybook and samples And there's webcomponents.org if you want to learn more about web components. And there's the Esri Community where you can ask questions. As well, for the users who have experience with AMD and script tags, there's a blog we released in October that covers some of these patterns. So this blog might be of some use. If I just open that up. Here we go. So this blog is about building GIS web apps with the JavaScript Maps SDK components, and it goes over what is the ArcGIS Maps SDK for JavaScript, what are web components, and then what is the JavaScript Maps SDK components, what does it include, as well as why are developers, again, why do they use these components, and a new way to build with components. So it goes over this AMD pattern that you're familiar with the require, but then it goes into, okay, now with components, you're not writing the require anymore, you're not going to the vanilla JavaScript right away. And it also covers integrating your apps with calcite. So pretty much a lot of the things we've covered, they're also in the blogs, and we'll keep updating the documentation to support these different workflows that you guys have.
I was going to show two more resources just for things that I showed. Let me see if I can get it back. For the demo code that I did in Vue, that's all available in GitHub under Developer Summits Demos 2024 in my repo, Kelly Hutchins. And I'll leave that up for just a minute. And for those of you who are working with vanilla JavaScript and want to maybe try out Vite, I did a session yesterday with Jeremy, and we used components to demo while working with web apps. And there's like 5 different little Vite demos here that show pop-up in a side panel and a few other things. So if you want more examples of working with components and vanilla JavaScript and Vite, it has some of the patterns that Omar talked about earlier in that repo as well. Let me put the slides back for.
Yeah, and with that, please share your feedback. Let us know how we did and maybe what else you'd like to see in future sessions. And connect with us on social media. There's a hashtag. And with that, we can open it up to questions. Thank you.
I think probably I saw that's the first hand I saw raised. I don't think we have an external microphone, so we'll just have to repeat it.
I can.
How do you deal with OAuth? So you got authorization.
The question was, how do you deal with OAuth authorizing? And I think it probably would just work because it's the underlying JS API components. I don't know if Omar or maybe Fred wants to add anything, but I think it's just going to work because it uses the JS API components underneath.
Answer about OAuth.
I know you. No, seriously, go.
Okay. The OAuth, in terms of you're talking about Esri config, identity manager. So with that, we'll be releasing some documentation about it roughly next week on how to do that. We don't have components for that yet, but we're researching that just to make it easier to set up and wrap your components with what we might call portal components. So that's in the pipeline, but for now, you still have to use the core JavaScript API approach of setting up the Esri config, the identity manager, and lining that up with the web map.
Thank you. Thanks for the good presentation. If I understand right, this is still in beta, is that correct? And roughly when do you think it's going to be official, past beta?
I'll leave that for Omar.
Yeah, I can talk about that. So our goal is probably by 2025 Dev Summit, everything should be fleshed out, but it could happen anytime before, maybe at UC, but that remains to be seen. We're collecting a lot of feedback, getting enhancement requests and feature requests, maybe even component requests, and just seeing where we can go with that, and then updating the documentation and samples. So it all depends on really feedback and features and how much we want to implement before we get out of beta. Thanks.
I don't think you need that.
Oh.
There's an assumption in your code that you're connected to a map. So where is that in your code base? That you've got a portal connection, and that map ID is defined.
So the question is, there's an assumption that you're connected to a map. So the sample showed the map component, ArcGIS map, and it has an item ID, and that item ID is the item ID for that web map in online or enterprise. If it's in enterprise, you'll have to use Esri config portal URL to set that portal URL to point to that location. So my.org dot blah 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 dot blah blah blah.
So it's an assumption that it's an ArcGIS Online.
It's ArcGIS Online or Enterprise, yeah. Omar, did you have any more to add to that?
Yeah, if you don't want to use ArcGIS Online, you'd have to set up the Esri config and point it to your domain, and from there it should just work.
But once you, like if you had a web map, it could just be like a topo-based map or something. Once you have it, you can get the map and you could add additional layers or services or whatever else you need to do.
Sorry.
So if we have to go into the JavaScript to do some of the things like the OAuth and other things, is it the same object in JavaScript? Is the map still the map and the view still the view? So we don't lose any properties on those in the JavaScript by starting with a web component?
Yeah, that's correct. So if you go to the component reference and to the map component, you'll find there's a map property and there's a view property. So if you still want that same business logic that you're used to, it's still there. So you can get access to the map property and then do any work on that map or on that web map, or use that information from there to maybe get like a title from the portal, things like that. So.
And there are sample in that building web apps GitHub repo that I posted. There are samples that use the vanilla JavaScript and show how to work with the map and add layers to it and change properties on the map. So that might be helpful.
Guess that's all. Thank you.